All right, Brandon, here we are
Here
back
we are.
for another episode of All Questions Considered, a weekly show where we try to engage curiosity, sit in the discomfort of not having all of the answers or quick and easy answers, and learn to just love the questions themselves. I'm Pastor Drew, and I'm here with Brandon, and tonight talking all of considering all these questions about faith and science.
Yeah, I'm curious, Drew. When growing up, faith, science, did it feel like an either or kind of dilemma to you when you're growing up?
It did not. Uh, I
No.
I will say so. Here's the interesting thing about I think growing up. Part of the majority religion, and in many ways, part of the majority culture of um, the country and the world and the place where I lived, but being part of a mainline Protestant denomination as opposed to um, sort of like Baptist or Catholic, like I picked up a lot of stuff from school and from friends that it was like, well, you can't, yeah, that like other people felt these things were at odds. I
Uh,
didn't necessarily get that from church or personally or at home or anything
okay.
that there was friction between these two. What about you?
Yeah. So for you, it sounds like you were in one of those triangles where like he's not friends with like my friend doesn't like him, or you have to choose between him and him, but you're like, I'm actually friends with both of them. I don't know why other people are choosing sides.
Yes,
Um, for me,
absolutely.
there was a little bit of that discrepancy between the two. I don't know what the right word is there. They didn't fully overlap for me. I remember in my like middle school, I put my bed in the closet because I wanted more room in my room to like play basketball on the Nerf hoop. And so I remember
Nice,
going
as
to
all
sleep at
people
night.
do.
Yeah.
I'm just like I've got the stepbrothers. Like, if we loft the bed, so we'll have so much room for activities.
That was me. So I would sleep in the closet where my bookshelves were, and I remember I had this book called The Lie by I think it was by Ken Ham, and it had a serpent on the front, and it was about how evolution is a lie that whatever that the public school system is pushing or something. Um, and so I don't think I ever actually read it, but I remember falling asleep looking at this book called The Lie, and it had a very scary cover.
Yeah.
And so there was like a vague feeling of like, I need to learn what my biology teacher is teaching for the test, but I need to make sure I don't actually fully believe it
Hmm.
because this is all a lie. So I had some of that like belief of I have to be careful about what science is preaching because I really want to be a person of faith.
Yeah. Well, two things. One, I'm going to pause this. Anybody share your questions in the chat, especially about faith and science that you have. What was it like growing up for you folks, right? You listeners, were science and faith opposing forces? Were they complementary? Were they just like so far separate that, who knows? Or maybe and then I hear in what you're sharing, Brandon, this sense of perhaps there's competing claims for truth, right? Even the framing of that book, right? The lie.
Yeah,
um there's competing claims for truth that both religion and faith are making, and so is science about what is true, and feeling the pull between the two to pick a side.
yeah,
um that maybe only for who's got the claim to truth. And I think some of that sits at the heart of this question that we titled the episode with, right? How do science and faith relate? um I think perhaps that theme of truth probably isn't going anywhere for the next 40 minutes as we talk.
yeah. So, Drew, as we get into this, I think for anybody who's watched some episodes, there's not going to be like a reveal here of, oh, wait, these are not opposed to each other. They're not mutually exclusive. So I feel like I can pop that. But I'm curious. I've heard this, you've heard the phrase, I'm a man of science or I'm a man of faith. Like they are these two different things. So Drew, if you had
Hmm.
to put yourself in one of those categories, are you a man of science or are you a man of faith?
Well, let's see. um Gosh, if I had to pick,
You
which
have
is like
to.
my least favorite thing to do on several, like not only sort of like theologically, where I like to hold kind of my both ands instead of my either ors, but also as an Enneagram 9 that likes to harmonize everything. Like this is just my worst nightmare is to have to choose an either or situation. I have to pick Man of Faith, if only for the fact that I'm in a collar. But to me it really feels like a false dichotomy. Like it feels like such a, like not
Yeah.
even the way I grew up, but the more I've grown in understanding of these things, I'm just like, why are we picking? But we do all the time, like you said, right? Like um we have these ways of describing ourselves. um
So you
and
said they're not these mutually opposing things. So for you, how do you see faith and science? Are they two different things talking about different things in different ways? Are they talking about the same thing in different ways? How do these, as the episode title is, how do faith and science relate?
I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think that part of the beauty of it is it's a little bit complicated. Like it's not necessarily simple and straightforward, because so we've already touched on both of them talk about truth, like
Mm,
uncovering or discovering truth. I think both science and faith start to talk about kind of like why things are the way they are, right? Both of them talk about sort of what led up to where we're at right now. You know, there's stories of faith and frameworks of faith. Both of them have kind of a framework of discovery, or and of understanding. You know, how did the Earth get here? Um, some of those questions can be posed of both faith and science. I think they have different methodologies, if
mm,
I can maybe use an academic sort of term, of the scientific sort of term, right? Like we have the scientific method for exploring in things, and the methods of faith, we'd maybe call them faith practices. Um, and yet I see them as two related pursuits for uncovering what's going on here,
mm,
in a very large sense, right? What does it mean to be alive? What How does our world work? I think that very often, um, I would say that science really, at its core, starts to pick at the hows
mm,
of life. How does this work? Kind of what's Yeah, how does this work? How is this set up? How did we get here? And faith maybe leans a little more in the why, though it does. Certain stories of scripture also play in the how realm. I think there are some great, like, I think of folks like Albert Einstein or C.S. Lewis, or these people who stood in that middle ground very much of faith and science, and saying like, no, these things work together. And some of them talk about, uh, oh gosh, and now I can't even remember who it was now, but there's a famous quote. I'll have to look it up in a second here when you're asking the next question, of who said, like, science talks about how the heavens work, seeks to understand how the heavens work. It was maybe Galileo, in fact. Like it might be that old. But science seeks to understand how the heavens work, and religion tells us how to get to heaven. um, which I think
uh,
is an interesting framework for putting on it. I have some qualms about what faith
get to
is
heaven.
about that understanding
Yeah.
of faith. But this, like, how does what we're doing here work? And then I would say very generally, like, my starting point for how these things relate to each other is, I would say that science and reason are gifts of God, and ways that God has invited humanity to participate in the ongoing unfolding of the universe. And so it's not that, like, I can look to theologians to tell me answers to these questions, or I can look to scientists.
Mm,
I think we're at our best when we say, I can look, I can ask a table that around which are sitting scientists, theologians, anthropologists,
mm,
all of these different schools, to start to understand. uh, what this universe is, and how
Yeah.
God is at work within it.
I love it. One of my favorite historians, Kieran Armstrong, a religious historian,
Yeah.
often talks about the difference between logos and mythos.
Mm,
And so that's one framework of kind of letting both of them play together, but in different lanes. She would talk about that for thousands of years, humans have had different ways of knowing. And one of those ways of knowing is a way that called logos, which is kind of what we could, the bucket that we could put science in. So this is kind of the more observational. You can test it, poke it, prod it. But then there's another way of knowing that people have used for thousands of years. That's mythos, and it's not a scientific observational way of knowing the universe, but rather a different language system of knowing. And I think even our modern brains think of what does it mean to know in a very
mm,
logos, scientific, rational kind of way. But for many years, people have valued other ways of knowing, like the mythos way of knowing, where you're kind of talking about it sometimes more poetically, sometimes through story, those different ways. So I love how she kind of says, and in some ways, she will map it to the brain and the left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere of the brain, as these two ways of knowing that are integral to what it means to be human. And to downplay either one of them, we have to be careful of doing that to our own detriment. So yeah, I love that. So here's
yeah.
a question for you, Drew. Why do so many people see faith and science as opposed forces?
Yeah. Well, I think one, I want to confirm. I did look it up. Galileo. It was Galileo who had his own
Good
bones with the
guess.
church, right? Of the you know how the heavens work.
Oh yeah,
He's
did he get excommunicated or did he get
yes.
beheaded? Or
At least the first. I don't
yeah.
remember about the second. But for literally like bringing new understanding of the heavens, of the cosmos, right?
Oh
Which are
wow,
like,
yeah.
why would we not want to understand more about this beautiful, amazing universe? I think that a couple of things play into why science and faith become opposing forces for a lot of folks, or that we feel like they are. I think that one of the reasons for that is something we've said a few times already, but like truth and the language of truth, or even you were talking about, how do we know things? Well, we tend to we tend to think about that in one way. Or I think even this plays in on sort of in the modern era, kind of enlightenment forward. Um, so 1700s or so, to roughly modern time, like current times. um, we started talking about like evidence for God, and almost trying to apply science to like back to, to take
Mm,
that logos framework you were talking about and apply it to things that are dealing in mythos. Or I think
yeah.
this happens all the time too in when we're trying to talk about history, when like even in this around the same time in the enlightenment period, you get the quest for the historical Jesus, right? Like, who was the Jesus of history, not just the
Mm,
Jesus of the Bible? Well, part of the problem is the writings about Jesus in the Bible are not history in the way we tell history in the modern era, or try to tell history in the modern era. They're history and interpretation melded together. There was a different framework of telling about something that happened. You're interpreting it as you're passing it on, which I would argue we do that no matter what.
yeah.
But they weren't even trying to be sort of objective, or apply this
Accurate in that
certain
way.
framework. Yeah, but this, I mean, I think that that sense of like trying to apply, we took reason. We were in an age of reason, and we tried to like apply then that reason. I mean, I think it's why some of our founding fathers, right, were like scratching out like the stuff that seems unreasonable, like the miracles. Thomas Jefferson's pulling miracles out of the Bible because it's unreasonable. I can't
Mm,
rationally understand it. Um, and I want, and maybe in an effort to even harmonize, right, like reason and science and
yeah.
faith, is like, well, let me get rid of the unreasonable stuff, the stuff that's beyond what I can comprehend in the natural, or what we can understand of the natural world, the supernatural, right? Let's remove it. I think that then that sense that both talk about like truth, right? Like this is fact, this is the
Mm.
way that it is. I think religious folks, we get a little ornery about anything, especially if we're in a sort of if we make exclusive claims to the truth, which some people would look at Jesus' statement like "I am the way, the truth, and the
Mm.
life, and no one comes to the Father except through me," and say, "Well, that's a pretty exclusive claim. So if Jesus is the truth, then anything else that seems to be making claims to truth is there." I think in an interesting way, we also have in the current era, we'll talk about science with some of the same language we talk about faith.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
so I mentioned before we got started that if anybody wants to like dive into somebody who spent more time figuring out good ways to articulate science and faith and the cosmos, Rob Bell's "Everything is Spiritual," especially the second part where he kind of like starts at Big Bang, but he talks about how when scientists write about the singularity at the beginning of creation, like they use poetic language. Like, right, like it sounds almost like scripture, and it sounds
Yeah.
like poetry and beauty, because it's the only language you have for it. So there's like one kind of maybe beautiful blurring of the two. But then I think there's also this interesting thing of like, I believe in science, where it's like, I don't know if that's the right word, but it almost sounds like people are putting their faith in, like,
It's a confession of belief.
right,
Yes.
yeah, and so I think it's this interesting mix of, or in the sense, to go back to your kind of, what you were sharing from Karen Armstrong with two halves of the brain and that kind of thing, like, to me, that goes, "Okay, well, it's two halves of a whole,"
Mm.
but anytime we try and move the whole to one side or the other, then we're gonna realize that we're missing something, and then we run the danger of those being sort of opposing forces, because rather than just like a pendulum swinging, like, or it becomes a pendulum swinging back and forth rather than finding a space in the fullness.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think about, if these are two different um, kind of language systems, maybe you could say,
Mhm.
kind of a faith language system or a religious language system, and then a science language system, talking about, they can be talking about the same thing, but in very different ways. Um, yeah, I'm curious. Do you see faith and science, religion and science? I don't know if you want me to steer it to include religion.
Yeah.
Do you see them as ever actually disagreeing? So, of course, we can, at some level, there's people who see these things as opposed. But do you ever see them as opposed in any ways? Have there been times in history that you see these things actually saying different things about the same thing?
Yeah, well, in fact, that's maybe one of maybe the another thing that leads to a lot of us viewing them as in opposition to each other, is like a new understanding of the way things
Mm.
work, is hard. I work with a lot of churches that are going through organizational change, and have read a lot about like change management and things, right? And we don't, uh, systems don't like a lot of change that gets introduced, and so you think of like Galileo saying, "Hey, actually, this isn't the way that our solar system is structured. Um, this isn't the way that the cosmos works." And you have the church being like, don't like it, don't want to deal with it, don't want to have to think about what this might open up. You're opening up a can of worms that we don't want to tread on, and we're out, right? Like,
Mm.
and actually, we're not out, you're out. Get out of here with your craziness. It, I think that it's really hard, like gaining new information that challenges the way we've always thought about something or the way we've always done something. That happens, and the this sort of, I don't want to falsely make a claim that like we have more scientific knowledge necessarily than previous generations or eras. but certainly like this scientific method from the Enlightenment forward and the level of technology that we have in certain ways today has meant that there are a lot more of those uh, er, shattering moments of like the way we've always done it or the way we've always thought about this. That have just completely reshaped. But it's not, again, it's not altogether new, right? You had Europeans having, uh, an existential crisis when they find out that the lands that Columbus sailed to weren't actually where they thought. And there's like this whole place that they call the New World, which is like totally mistakenly, right? But like they're wrestling with this idea of like we didn't think there was anything over there. Like there's a whole other half of this thing that we didn't think
Yeah.
existed. Um, and and that kind of stuff. I mean, I can think about Webb telescope images. I think about evolution. It seems like science is bringing them quicker and quicker to us, and I think that they're hard. Sometimes they do bring a challenge to faith. So I mean, one of I think evolution is an easy example in the sense of uh, depending on how people thought about and read the creation narratives in scripture, um, evolution was a hard hit, right? It's like it poses still to if depending on how you read those creation stories, um, poses a stark contrast, right? Because they seem to say God made people, right?
Yeah.
Like
This
people showed up.
this
Um,
scientific history book is saying something different than my Genesis scientific history
right.
book. Yeah.
And again, I think it comes back to how are you reading those creation stories? What's going on there? And at which point I would say, one of the interesting things I've been teaching a lot of early church history to my adult education class. It's Spirit in the Hills, and um, people have been reading the Bible a lot of different ways. Like there are people that were reading Genesis 1 metaphorically before there was Christians, and reading it as poetry. And there were certainly people in the early church that were some who seemed to be reading it sort of like literally and historically, and some who were already saying, no, that doesn't, seem to kind of check out with us, and that's not what we think that this writing is actually trying to reveal to us. Um, and but again, right, like depending on your what religion has been saying up to that point, I would say another one, right, is well, this is more complicated. I'm trying to figure out the right ways to say it. But so there was bad science um that said that like certain types of humans were genetically different than other humans, right? So
Mhm.
racism was reinforced by bad science uh in the early centuries of this country. That like, oh no, 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 like different people are genetically different and their brains are different sizes and development that literally made some people made white people like that's part of white supremacy. Like it was white supremacy sold as science
Mm.
and fact and truth that was not. And yet then when you see science sort of, which is part of the beauty of science, is this kind of like built-in process when it's done well of peer review, and you go check and you can run somebody's experiment the same way and see, well, is it true and is it not? And then when the rest of the community comes around and says like, no, this is a bunch of crap, this is not true, this is not the way that this works, being able to adjust is hard for everybody, including religion. But I mean, I think of the way that religion often works is that it will take stuff like that. It'll take something that we have come to think about the way the world works, and we'll try and we'll try and come up with theology to justify what we're doing, rather than having a starting point of what God is up to, or what God is like revealed to us in Scripture, or for Christians revealed to us in Christ, and the Scriptures, and we'll muddle it up. I think of was it Pete Rollins likes to tell the parable about the cat and the monks that would lead meditation, and there was this cat, this annoying cat would come in and disturb this monastic community's worship service. So the leader of the worship service would tie up the cat to a pole, so that it wouldn't disturb everybody's meditation and worship. And the years go on, and eventually that leader dies. He was an old man, and the cat's still there, so they tie the cat up. Then the cat dies, and they go out and find another cat so they could tie up to the pole, because at this point, like, it's crucial to their liturgy that they tie up this cat to this pole. And then the theologians come and write, documents and doctrine on the theological significance of having a cat tied to a pole. Like when it's something that started as
A
just like a
practical.
a really practical need for this one cat that was just kind of like the people were annoyed, so they did this one thing that all of a sudden then you skip two generations and
There's
like
doctrine about why it's
right,
important.
exactly. And so I think the church is sometimes really bad at like going back and examining some of those doctrines that might be really silly and built
Mm,
upon sort of falsehoods and things. And religious movements, religious institutions in general. I mean, I think Jesus is dealing with it in his day with his own religious context when he's constantly arguing about like different understandings of Sabbath law, or when he's re-giving the law. You've heard it said, but I say to you. Um, and I think he's
yeah.
he's getting at the root of some of that stuff. And so maybe interestingly, we might could learn a little something from the way that science holds some of
Mm,
its theories and methods and re-examines them and holds it up to say, well, can you guys find the same thing in what you're doing? um,
yeah.
and
Well,
maybe
okay,
there's
I've
something
got two
there.
more questions for you. And if anybody's joining us, we're talking about faith and science, how they relate. If you have any questions, we probably have time for another one or two if you want to drop those in the comments of wherever you're watching. But Drew, I love that you're talking about kind of the way that science holds what they're finding, what they're believing in, if you will, the current assumptions of the day, and how religion sometimes does that. And I love that story of the monks and the cat, because oftentimes, like you said, we'll kind of use theology to reinforce maybe what we already believe. And so we'll kind of use it to prop up our own biases and current beliefs. But with science, it seems a little bit more clear to me what the goal and aim is to kind of understand how things work at a certain level, at a certain kind of observable, rational level. But on the faith side, like, what is the goal? What is the aim? What should be the driver or engine behind how we are doing theology, and maybe sometimes even redoing theology? What is the goal there? With science, it's to kind of, well, I'll kind of share a quote that I've heard about science is often trying to photograph reality, whereas religion is trying to merge with it.
Hmm.
And I've liked that distinction, but I'm curious for you. With science, there's kind of this engine to try to understand objective, rational reality. But with religion and with theology, what is a healthy goal and aim with our theology?
Yeah. No, I do. I really like and appreciate that. I think in some ways, maybe I think there's something to the question, who am I? Who
Mm,
is God? What is the world? And what is my sort of vocation and place in the world? Where maybe there's a little bit more overlap, right? Like how does this thing work? And therefore, what is my role in it? And where is God in all this? Right. Like I think some of those are some of the key questions that sort of keep our faith moving, and alive. Uh, and that's where I see like another way that I see science and faith relating. Like I see that science can be for many people uh, sort of a vocation, like the practice of science, being an engineer, a biologist, an anthropologist, being an archaeologist, historian, whatever sort of science. astrophysicist. Like, it can be a vocation. It can be the way that you live out God's call in your life by loving God and neighbor. I think about a friend of mine. We've been doing some work on. We talked last week about, or in the last episode, about the churchwide assembly and the climate goals and things. But he was like, I've come to see climate scientists as sort of like prophets.
Mm,
They've listened deeply to the earth crying out, and to God's good creation in the earth, and said, if you continue in these ways, bad stuff is coming. Therefore, we must change our path, right? Which very
yeah.
much is,
Wow.
in line with the prophetic tradition, right? Um, and so I see this beautiful sort of merging in those ways. I think that the goal of faith, I would say, is a right and loving relationship with
Mm,
God and neighbor and all of creation. And I think science is a big way we can do that we can work that out. I think the more that we know about, in the same way that it's hard to love your neighbor if you won't listen to and get to know your neighbor.
mm,
It's hard to love your neighbor and your world if you won't take the time to get to know it as it really is. Not from a distance, but kind of up close. So I mean, I think the part of the goal of faith is, um, proximity, it's love, it is loving relationship, it is living out that love in the here and now. um, and and that's maybe one of the places where we get tripped up, right? If faith is about, well, let me put it this way. I'll call back to earlier in the episode where I talked about Jesus saying, "I am the truth," right? And I think it's interesting that we then say, like, "Oh, well, like, science is going for the truth, and we're going for the truth." The interesting thing from a Christian standpoint, I would argue, um, the only way to know the truth that is Jesus is not through certainty and reason alone, but is in relationship, the way you and I know each other,
mm.
right? Like, if truth is a person, and then truth is uncovered and explored in relationship, which includes the fullness of ourselves, right? And asking good questions to one another, and all of these pieces and things, and not apart from that. And
Yeah.
so I think if when faith, um, sort of tries to take on the language system of, reason or science, and say, like, well, truth, it's about evidence and certainty in all of these ways. I think in our first episode, I mentioned something to the effect of, like, I can be certain about a relationship in a much different way than I am certain about,
Mm,
the fact that the world is round, right?
yeah.
Or that the climate is getting weirder and weirder, or, like, that 2 plus 2 is 4. I can be certain about that in a much different way than I am certain about, a relationship, um, or
Yeah,
about love.
it makes me think again about the historian Karen Armstrong. She would talk about um, how we can often think about in our modern day, after the Enlightenment and kind of the age of reason, we can think about science and faith both putting forward propositions about reality, and it's like we have to choose between this proposition and this proposition, and which one do we assent and agree with? But but actually, that's not how they're playing different games in different lanes in many ways. They're both talking about reality and engaging with reality, but in their different ways, and with mythos or kind of a faith language system, or even beyond just language. The way that faith and religion are engaging with reality can't be understood from the outside. It can't be something that somebody just tells you this is what we believe about reality with words that she says you actually have to enter into it. The language system, but also the practices, the rituals, the community, because all of those things go hand in hand with, like you're saying, engaging with a relationship with the world, relationship with each other, relationship with God that can't just be understood from. It's kind of like you're saying with relationship. Like if you told me about your wife, you said, she's 5 feet 6 inches, this color hair, this long hair, like all of those things I can't from the outside just be like, oh, now I know Lee. It's like, no, you
Right.
actually have to enter into relationship. And so I love that understanding of like mythos or faith or religion is something that is actually something that's more experiential. It's something you have to step into, something you have to participate in for it to like get inside you in a different way. The same reason, here's something else that I love. I could go off on this forever because I love this so much.
Good.
But I think it's interesting that nobody's content if there's a movie coming out that you're really excited about. Nobody's content with somebody just saying, "Let me give you the synopsis." You want to go like you can't say, "Oh, I read the synopsis. I know that movie." You want to go experience it. You want to participate and step into that movie in a way that I think religion is doing something kind of in that vein, where it's helping us step into and experience reality in a way that science is helpful, but it's doing one thing, and faith and religion might be doing something different. So, anyways, those
Yeah.
those are things that I'm playing with right now as I'm coming back around to faith and religion, and in some ways using my head to talk myself into why they're important.
Yeah. Well, no, I do think I have found that to be true that and there are pastors and theologians that would kind of point out, or biblical scholars would say, you know, and again, focus on Christianity here, but like Jesus is constantly inviting people to follow him much more frequently than he's saying like believe in me or
Yeah,
believe this particular thing about me, right? Like because I think there's even maybe a difference there between like a believe in me and a believe in this clearly lined out systematic theology that I've put
yeah,
together, which is not something that Jesus seems to be like prioritizing in the way that he is teaching and living and moving and healing in the world. So yeah, that sense of you kind of got to be there. Well,
you
I mean,
had to be there.
I think about like trying to describe like what the liturgy is, or even I think in last week, talking about what a church-wide assembly is, and I can like tell you about it and what
Mm.
happened there, but it was also a very different experience to be there. Or I can read, I love the thing about the movies because like I'm not afraid of reading the descriptions on the next
Yeah,
episode on Netflix or whatever because I know that watching the episode's going to be different.
yeah.
Like, and it's not gonna like if I might, unless occasionally there's like a really terrible spoiler in them, and then I'm kind of upset. But even so, it's like, well, I want to see how that plays out, right? Like, I want to know the buildup. I want to feel it as
Yeah,
much as I want to know it.
for sure. I love it. Well, here's my last question for you, Drew. Um, we're talking a lot about how these two different things, faith and science, can kind of be in different lanes, kind of doing different things, and helping us in the two halves to the same whole. But in what ways, or in any ways, do you see them overlapping and informing each other? Does faith sometimes speak to or inform how we do science, how we understand what science might be saying? And does science sometimes speak to faith and kind of help us understand how we are trying to merge with, participate in reality, understand God, understand neighbor in the world? Yeah, do you see these things as informing and in relationship in that way?
I think so. And I am sure that somebody, more involved in this would like who is living both their faith and their vocation as, you know,
Mm,
engineer, physicist, biologist, nanobiologist, whatever, probably has, beautiful insights. In fact, I've, had the joy of reading some of those insights and things from different folks. But I I think one, maybe two quick ones. I think being grounded in faith and moving into the world of science, I hope leaves you open to this sense of wonder and awe and maybe the unexpected, and maybe gives you like perhaps your motivation for doing this. So again, I'm going to pull because it's where I've been living lately. Catherine Hayhoe is an evangelical Christian, and she is also a professor a climate scientist at Texas Tech University, and she has a
Mm,
book called Saving Us. And like for her, um, there's a like we got to do this to help humanity, like undergirding her purpose for her work and her research and the way that she talks about it is this deep love of God and neighbor,
mm.
that sort of propels her forward in what she's doing, and informs, I guess gives like an extra layer of meaning to the pursuit rather than just the pursuit's sake, but like this is for my neighbor, this is for, um, us. And you can find that, I not that you can't find that apart from faith. I'm sure people do all the time. But I think that that's one way that faith can maybe inform some of our science, this kind of like awe and wonder or sense of, meaning and purpose of how this might explore. And then I can give you one very like practical way, that might be a little trippy and kind of cliffhangery. I don't want to like leave people too much on the hook, but uh, an understanding of, quantum physics has informed my, thoughts on what, uh, the end times and like a heaven on earth might could look like. So in my exploration of this thing that I would claim to be a mystery, and like I don't fully understand how it is, but how does God raise to life, um, a new heaven and a new earth where the this one is, and bring like life back with, when I'm like, well, there's like a law of conservation of mass and matter. But then quantum physics is like, well, yeah, but sometimes like things appear to be in two places at the same, like electrons could be in two places at the same time, and we're not quite sure, but it's the same one, or like these unexplainable things, uh, can inform that way. But it's like, well, what if just, you know, in the fullness of time, and the fullness of heaven on earth, conservation of matter is not a concern anymore. And the same, we can share atoms in a way that we weren't able to before. Um, and it's like the more that I learn about some of that kind of stuff, the more that I am opened up to, ways that impossible things are already sort of happening in this universe.
Yeah, I totally feel that. Kind of in a similar way, science has um, in many ways tore my faith apart, at some seasons of life, and then in other seasons of life has rebuilt my faith, because of science has led me back to a place um, of wanting to and finding a faith kind of language system meaningful again. Like you said, things like quantum physics, things like realizing the entanglement of all of the energy and things like it's like, oh wow, it's almost impossible to speak about reality on some levels without getting poetic and even religious. And in some ways, leads me back to religion and kind of a mythos type approach to trying to describe and understand and relate to reality. And then in the other way around, sometimes science, especially living in this day and age, can feel a little bit bleak and heavy and a little bit of doom and gloom, a little bit like, oh, is my son and maybe his son is that going to be a few more generations and this is it.
Mm.
And sometimes it's my faith in that way of engaging and relating to reality that leads me to engage with science in a different way, that leads me to say everything's kind of pointing this way, but I actually feel like there's some hope in here, not because the data and the numbers are showing it yet, but because something deeper in me with how I'm relating to reality says that I can find hope even in the darkest times. So I find for myself those things constantly playing off each other, and like you said, they're two halves to the same whole. So I find
Yeah.
anytime I'm letting one more override the other one, it's probably a good time to pause and say, what does the other half here say to help inform how I'm understanding and relating to reality? So I love
Yeah.
that. I love
Well,
it.
I think of, Martin Luther famously maybe said, something along the lines of, when posed with the question of like, if you knew what you're talking about, kind of like science seems to be pointing this way sometimes. Like, if you knew that the world was ending tomorrow, like you knew it's all done
Yeah.
tomorrow, what would you do? He said, I'd plant an apple tree, and not just like any tree, right? Like, but a tree that's going to take years to bear fruit, right? Which is this, in some ways, this just like silly but like defiant act of hope, um, speaking to what his faith seemed to kind of call and bring, conjure up within him, this sort of spirit of hope in death and resurrection. And like, even if I know that the end is coming, here's what I'm doing: plant something that's going to bear fruit in the future. And we need some of that as we're moving on. We need some of that way to look
Yeah.
at things.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Brandon. Thanks for a wonderful conversation on relationship between faith and science. And maybe we'll have to pick some of these kind of. We'll probably revisit the topic and maybe some specific ways, and we'll get to talk about some of those other nitty gritty things. And then I know that we've got parenting videos that we're working on. So if you are like me and Brandon and have questions about how do I share my faith, how do I talk about these things like faith and science and how they relate to one another, and the way that different people see it differently in the world. If you want to know how to talk about that with your kids and you're trying to figure it out, we're going to hopefully give some videos that are do that, and then also create a Facebook group so that we can connect with each other, because parenting is exhausting enough, that it's nice to be able to do that in community. And so they're centered around different topics about how do I talk about my faith with my kids, especially maybe when I'm not quite sure, right? When I don't have a ton of certainty around my beliefs, or when I was given only one sort of model of how to do that, and it's not going to work for me in this season of my life. So look for more information on that. Otherwise, all questions considered, we do the show live Tuesdays at 9 p.m. Central, wherever you're watching this and listening to it. And it's also available on podcast services. We love hearing your questions. We do have a few kind of lingering questions that we'll hope to bring in to some other topics in the days and weeks ahead. Anything else I'm missing there on kind of
I think you
notes?
made, I think it's new, or I'm behind the times. You
Yeah.
made a Facebook page for All Questions
Yes.
Considered.
Yeah, Brandon and I, this is, this is a new thing. We're in 8, but we're kind of like, almost 2 months into this at this point. We've
Yeah.
been trying to figure out what's the best places for us to connect with you. How can you find information and just kind of find the show? And so it seems like it might be easier. We made a Facebook page, and we also made a YouTube channel for All Questions Considered, and we'll hope to kind of host things there, at least for the time being. We're going to be on the same channels we've been on, so you can find us on the Spirit in the Hills social channels and on some of our personal social media channels, but also in these other places. And the goal is to kind of give us a bit of a one-stop shop, but that way you can just follow All Questions Considered. So go and like the page, go and see if you can follow us on subscribe to the YouTube channel, give us some likes and things, and share with some friends, and thank you everybody that has listened to any of these every week. And I always appreciate when I get a text message or an email or something that's like, oh, I liked this, or I have this question from this. So keep sending that stuff in, but also we're hoping that that Facebook page can be a place where you can go, and we'll be asking for your input on the shows ahead of time and afterwards, and that you can maybe we'll get a form up there where you can submit a question anytime,
Ooh, yeah.
and get things moving on that. So trying to figure out the best ways for you good folks who have been listening and watching along with us can be a part of the show.
Love it, man.
All right. So we will see you next Tuesday at 9. And until then, ask a good question.
Ask a good question.